Last summer, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. I'd been feeling overwhelmed with work and city life in Richmond, and I thought some time alone in nature would do me good. I'd always loved hiking and camping, but I'd never gone on a trip by myself before. The idea both excited and nervous me, but I was determined to prove to myself that I could handle it. I spent weeks planning the trip, researching the best trails and campsites in the park. I chose a less popular area, hoping for some real solitude. I packed all the essentials: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, and of course my trusty hiking boots. I also brought along a few books and a journal, thinking I'd have plenty of time for reading and reflection. The drive from Richmond to Shenandoah took about 3 hours. As I approached the park, I could see the Blue Ridge Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks shrouded in a light mist. It was a beautiful sight, and I felt a surge of excitement. I stopped at the park entrance to get my permit and chat with the ranger about the trail conditions and weather forecast. Everything looked good for the next few days: clear skies and mild temperatures. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off on my adventure. The first day of hiking was exhilarating. The trail wound through dense forests of oak and hickory, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning vistas of the Shenandoah Valley. I saw a few other hikers early on, but as I went deeper into the park, I found myself alone with nature. The only sounds were my footsteps on the path, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional call of a bird. By late afternoon, I reached my first campsite. It was a small clearing near a babbling stream, surrounded by tall trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared a simple dinner of instant noodles and trail mix. As I sat by the fire, watching the sunset and the stars come out, I felt a deep sense of peace. This was exactly what I needed. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly, lulled by the gentle sound of the stream. The next morning I woke up early, eager to continue my journey. After a quick breakfast and breaking camp, I hit the trail again. The second day of hiking was more challenging, with steeper inclines and rougher terrain, but the views were even more spectacular. I reached the summit of Hawksbill Mountain, the highest peak in the park, and was rewarded with a breathtaking 360-degree view of the surrounding landscape. I arrived at my second campsite in the late afternoon. This one was more secluded than the first, located in a small meadow surrounded by dense forest. I went through the same routine of setting up camp and preparing dinner. As night fell, I noticed how much darker it was here, away from any sources of light pollution. The stars were incredibly bright, and I spent a long time just gazing up at the Milky Way, feeling small but connected to the vastness of the universe. It was on this second night that things took an unsettling turn. I had gone to bed early, tired from the day's hike. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was awakened by a noise outside my tent. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal. But as I lay there listening, I realized it sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone, or something, was walking around my tent. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon looking for food. But the footsteps sounded too heavy for a small animal. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. I lay there frozen, straining my ears to make out what was being said, but it was too quiet and muffled. The footsteps continued, circling my tent slowly. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but fear kept me silent. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was awake. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I gathered my courage and called out, asking who was there. The footsteps and whispering immediately stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the noises had been. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, but there was no response. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle tense, listening for any sound. Eventually, exhaustion must have overtaken me because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight was filtering through the walls of my tent, and birds were singing cheerfully outside. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. But as soon as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I knew it hadn't been a dream. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. Not animal tracks, but clearly human footprints, circling my tent just as I had heard the night before. I stood there staring at the prints in disbelief. And then I noticed something even stranger. The footprints just ended. There were no tracks leading away from my campsite, no sign of where this person had come from or gone to. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air, walked around my tent, and then vanished. I've never packed up camp so quickly in my life. I threw everything into my backpack, not bothering to organize it properly, and practically ran back to the trailhead. The hike back, which should have taken most of the day, I did in just a few hours, fueled by adrenaline and fear. When I reached the ranger station, I was out of breath and probably looked a bit wild-eyed. The ranger on duty, a kind-faced older man named Bob, asked if I was okay. I blurted out my story, telling him about the footsteps, the whispers, and the mysterious footprints. To my surprise, Bob didn't look skeptical. Instead, he nodded gravely and said that I wasn't the first person to report something like this. He didn't elaborate, but the way he said it made me think these incidents weren't uncommon. Bob offered to send someone to check out my campsite, but I declined. I just wanted to get back to my car and go home. He made me sit down and have some water before leaving, making sure I was okay to drive. As I was about to leave, he gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I ever wanted to talk about it. The drive back to Richmond was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I kept going over every detail, wondering if there was some logical explanation I was missing. Could it have been other campers playing a prank? But how would they have disappeared without leaving tracks? And why would the ranger have acted like it was a known phenomenon? When I got home, I spent hours researching online, looking for similar stories from Shenandoah or other national parks. I found a few vague accounts that sounded similar to my experience, but nothing conclusive. I thought about calling Bob the ranger, but I wasn't sure what else I could tell him. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about it often. I haven't been camping since, although I'm starting to feel the itch to get back out in nature. Maybe I'll try a group camping trip next time, though. As much as I enjoyed the solitude of my solo adventure, I think I'd feel safer with other people around. I'm sharing this story not to scare anyone or to discourage people from enjoying our national parks. Shenandoah is a beautiful place, and I had 2 amazing days there before that strange night, but I think it's important to share our experiences, even the ones we can't explain. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience and can shed some light on what happened. Or maybe it will remain a mystery, one of those unexplained events that reminds us that the world is still full of surprises and unknowns. A few years ago, I went on a camping trip with 4 of my closest friends to Olympic National Park in Washington. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to explore the diverse landscapes of the park. From its lush rainforests to rugged coastlines and majestic mountains. Our group consisted of me, Tom, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa. We'd all been friends since college, and though we didn't get to see each other as often as we'd like due to our busy lives, We made it a point to go on an adventure together at least once a year. We arrived at the park on a sunny Friday afternoon in late June. The weather was perfect. Warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. We checked in at the visitor center, where a friendly ranger gave us a rundown of the park rules, trail conditions, and wildlife to watch out for. She emphasized the importance of staying on marked trails and always letting someone know where you're going if you decide to explore on your own. We decided to set up our base camp at the Hoh Campground, which is located in the heart of the Hoh Rainforest. The drive there was breathtaking, with towering trees draped in moss creating a cathedral-like canopy above us. As we wound our way through the forest, we caught glimpses of elk grazing in meadows and even spotted a black bear in the distance. Upon reaching the campground, we found a nice spot that could accommodate our 3 tents. We spent the next couple of hours setting up camp, unpacking our gear, and getting organized for the days ahead. As the sun began to set, we gathered around our campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The excitement for our upcoming adventures was palpable. The next morning, we woke up early, ready to start exploring. After a hearty breakfast of oatmeal and freeze-dried fruit, we hit the Hoh River Trail. The trail was relatively easy, winding through the rainforest alongside the Hoh River. We marveled at the enormous Sitka spruces and western hemlocks, some of which were over 200 feet tall and several hundred years old. The forest floor was a carpet of ferns and moss, with mushrooms of all shapes and colors popping up everywhere. We hiked for about 4 hours, stopping frequently to take photos and admire the scenery. Around midday, we reached a beautiful spot by the river where we decided to have lunch. As we sat there, munching on our trail mix and sandwiches, Tom suggested that we split up for the afternoon. He was keen to push on further up the trail, while some of us were feeling a bit tired and wanted to take it easy. At first, I was hesitant about the idea of splitting up. The ranger's words about staying together were still fresh in my mind. But Tom was an experienced hiker, and he promised he wouldn't go too far. He said he'd be back at the campsite by dinner time. After some discussion, we agreed to the plan. Sarah decided to join Tom, while Mike, Lisa, and I headed back towards the campground, planning to explore some of the shorter nature trails near our camp. Tom and Sarah set off up the trail, and the rest of us began our leisurely walk back. We took our time, stopping to examine interesting plants and fungi, and even saw a family of river otters playing in the shallows of the Hoh River. It was a pleasant afternoon, and by the time we got back to the campsite, we were feeling relaxed and content. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Sarah returned to the camp alone. She explained that she and Tom had hiked for another hour or so before she decided to turn back. Tom had wanted to go a bit further, assuring her he'd be fine on his own and would return before dark. Sarah hadn't been comfortable with the idea, but didn't want to argue. At first, we weren't too worried. Tom was a capable outdoorsman, and we figured he'd just lost track of time, mesmerized by the beauty of the forest. But as the sky darkened and there was still no sign of him, our concern grew. We prepared dinner, hoping he'd show up at any moment, hungry and full of stories about what he'd seen. But the hours ticked by, and Tom didn't return. By 10 p.m., we knew something was wrong. We reported Tom's absence to the campground host, who immediately contacted the park rangers. They arrived quickly and began to organize a search party. They asked us detailed questions about when we'd last seen Tom, what he was wearing, and what supplies he had with him. We provided them with a recent photo and described his hiking experience and physical condition. The rangers explained that they would begin a search immediately, using flashlights and headlamps to navigate the trails. They advised us to stay at the campsite in case Tom returned on his own, and to keep our campfire going as a beacon. They also asked if any of us wanted to join the search, but cautioned that night searches in the dense forest could be dangerous for inexperienced hikers. Mike volunteered to join the search party while Lisa, Sarah, and I stayed behind at the campsite. None of us slept that night. We took turns tending the fire and watching the trail, hoping to see the beam of Tom's flashlight coming through the trees. The sounds of the forest, which had seemed so peaceful the night before, now felt ominous. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig had us on edge, wondering if it might be Tom finding his way back. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, there was still no sign of Tom. The rangers returned looking tired but determined. They reported that they had searched several miles of the trail and surrounding areas but found no trace of our friend. They were going to expand the search area and bring in more personnel, including a search dog team. Throughout the day, more search and rescue teams arrived. The campground became a hub of activity, with rangers, volunteers, and even a local news crew setting up a command center. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the vast expanse of forest from above. We felt helpless, pacing around the campsite and struggling to eat or rest. By late afternoon, the mood was grim. The rangers had found no signs of Tom, no discarded gear, no footprints off the trail, nothing. They began to discuss the possibility that he might have fallen and been injured, or even encountered a dangerous animal. The thought that our friend might be hurt or worse, alone in the wilderness, was almost unbearable. Just as the search teams were preparing for another night of searching, we heard a commotion from the direction of the trail. A group of hikers was approaching, and in their midst was a familiar figure, Tom. He looked exhausted, dirty, and confused, but he was alive. The relief we felt was indescribable. We rushed to Tom, hugging him and peppering him with questions. The rangers quickly took charge, guiding Tom to a first aid station they had set up. As they checked him over for injuries, Tom began to tell his story. He explained that after Sarah had turned back, he had continued up the trail for a while longer. He had been so captivated by the beauty of the forest that he lost track of time and distance. When he finally decided to head back, he realized he wasn't sure which way to go. He thought he was following the trail, but everything started to look unfamiliar. Tom said he had tried to retrace his steps, but it seemed like the landscape kept changing around him. He would think he recognized a certain tree or rock formation, only to find that the trail led somewhere completely different than he expected. As night fell, he became even more disoriented. He could hear voices calling his name, but every time he tried to move towards them, he seemed to end up further away. Wisely, Tom had decided to stay put once it got dark, remembering the survival tip about remaining in one place if you're lost. He had found a sheltered spot under a large fallen tree and tried to stay warm through the night. In the morning, he attempted to find his way again, but continued to feel like he was going in circles. What saved him in the end was running into a group of hikers who were aware of the search. They had recognized him from the description that had been circulated and guided him back to the campground. Tom was dehydrated and exhausted with numerous scratches from pushing through undergrowth, but otherwise unharmed. The rangers, while relieved, were also puzzled by Tom's account. The area where he had been hiking was well traveled, with clearly marked trails. They couldn't understand how an experienced hiker like Tom could have become so thoroughly lost. Some speculated that he might have accidentally ingested something that caused disorientation, while others wondered if the stress of being lost had affected his perception of time and distance, For his part, Tom seemed genuinely bewildered by his experience. He kept insisting that he had tried to follow our voices, but that somehow the sound had led him astray rather than back to camp. He also mentioned feeling like he was being watched at times, though he never saw anyone or anything unusual. After Tom had been checked over by the medical team and given the all-clear, we were finally able to relax a bit. The Rangers debriefed us all, taking detailed statements about what had happened. They emphasized the importance of always hiking with a buddy and carrying essential survival gear, even on short hikes. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, the mood was a mix of relief, exhaustion, and lingering confusion. We were overjoyed to have Tom back safely, but his story had left us all feeling unsettled. The forest around us, which had seemed so welcoming just days before, now felt mysterious and slightly menacing. We decided to cut our trip short, packing up the next morning to head home. As we drove out of the park, I couldn't help but look back at the towering trees and misty valleys, wondering what secrets they held. The experience had shaken our confidence and left us with more questions than answers. In the weeks that followed, we all struggled to make sense of what had happened. Tom in particular seemed changed by the experience. He was quieter, more introspective, and he flat out refused to go on any more camping trips. The rest of us found our enthusiasm for outdoor adventures somewhat dampened, at least for a while. Looking back on it now, I still can't fully explain what happened to Tom in Olympic National Park. Was it simply a case of a hiker becoming disoriented in unfamiliar terrain? Or was there something more mysterious at play? The experience taught us all valuable lessons about respecting nature and the importance of proper preparation and safety measures when exploring the wilderness. But it also reminded us that, even in this age of GPS and satellite technology, there are still places in the world where it's possible to become utterly, inexplicably lost. Back in 2018, my boyfriend Jake and I decided to take a camping trip near Lake Tahoe in California. We'd been together for about 2 years at that point, and we both loved the outdoors. We'd done a few shorter camping trips before, but this was going to be our first extended stay in the wilderness. We were excited to spend some quality time together away from the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives in San Francisco. We spent weeks planning the trip, poring over maps of the Lake Tahoe area and reading reviews of different campgrounds. We finally settled on a spot in the D.L. Bliss State Park, which is on the western shore of Lake Tahoe. It promised beautiful views of the lake, access to hiking trails, and a good balance of privacy and proximity to facilities. We packed up Jake's old Subaru Outback with all our camping gear, tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and enough food to last us for our planned 5-day stay. We also made sure to bring plenty of warm clothes, as even in summer, the nights can get chilly up in the mountains. The drive from San Francisco to Lake Tahoe took about 4 hours. As we climbed into the Sierra Nevada mountains, the scenery became more and more breathtaking. The air felt cleaner and crisper, and the scent of pine filled the car every time we rolled down the windows. We arrived at D.L. Bliss State Park in the early afternoon. The ranger at the entrance was friendly, giving us a map of the park and reminding us of the rules, especially about proper food storage to avoid attracting bears. We found our assigned campsite, which was nicely secluded, tucked away among some tall pines with a partial view of the lake through the trees. Setting up camp took us about an hour. We got the tent up, rolled out our sleeping bags, and organized our supplies. By the time we were done, the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden glow over the lake. We decided to take a short walk to stretch our legs after the long drive. There was a trail near our campsite that led down to a small, secluded beach. We followed it, holding hands and enjoying the peacefulness of the forest. The beach was beautiful, with clear blue-green water lapping at the shore and large, smooth boulders dotting the sand. We sat on one of these boulders, watching the sun set over the mountains on the other side of the lake. It was a perfect start to our trip. When we got back to our campsite, we cooked a simple dinner of pasta with canned sauce on our camping stove. As we ate, we talked about our plans for the next few days, hikes we wanted to take, beaches we wanted to visit, maybe even renting a kayak for a day. That first night was magical. The sky was clear, and being away from city lights, we could see more stars than either of us had ever seen before. We stayed up late, lying on a blanket outside our tent, pointing out constellations and seeing who could spot the most shooting stars. The next day, we woke up early, eager to start exploring. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, we set out on the Rubicon Trail, which offers stunning views of the lake as it winds along the shoreline. The hike was challenging in spots, with some steep climbs and rocky sections, but the views made it all worthwhile. We stopped for lunch at a viewpoint overlooking Emerald Bay, marveling at the tiny Fanette Island in the middle of the bright blue water. When we got back to our campsite in the late afternoon, we were tired but happy. We took a quick swim in the lake to cool off and wash away the sweat and dust from our hike. The water was cold but refreshing, and we felt invigorated afterward. As we were preparing dinner that evening, I noticed something odd. There was a man standing at the edge of our campsite, partially hidden behind a tree. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there watching us. At first, I thought he might be another camper who had gotten turned around and was trying to find his way back to his own site. But there was something off about the way he was just standing there, not moving or saying anything. I nudged Jake and discreetly pointed the man out to him. Jake called out, asking if the man needed any help. The stranger didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked into the woods. We were both a bit unsettled by this encounter, but we tried to shake it off. We reasoned that maybe the guy was just shy, or perhaps he didn't speak English and hadn't understood Jake's question. Still, we found ourselves speaking in lower voices for the rest of the evening, and I kept glancing towards the spot where we'd seen him. The next morning, we woke up to find that some of our things had been moved around. The cooler, which we'd left on the picnic table, was now on the ground. Some of our clothes, which we'd hung up to air out, were scattered on the ground. At first, we thought maybe a raccoon or other animal had gotten into our campsite overnight. But then we noticed that some things were missing. A couple of our knives were gone from the cooking set. Some of our food was missing, not just snacks, but also some of our canned goods and a package of dried meat. Most disturbing of all, some of our clothes were gone too. A couple of Jake's t-shirts and one of my sweaters. We were thoroughly freaked out at this point. We debated whether to report it to the park rangers, but we weren't sure what to say. We hadn't actually seen anyone take our things, and it seemed odd that a thief would take clothes along with food and knives. In the end, we decided to be more careful about securing our belongings and to keep a closer eye out for any strange activity. We tried not to let this incident ruin our trip. We spent the day exploring the park, hiking to Balancing Rock, a natural formation where a large boulder seems to defy gravity by balancing on a much smaller base. We also visited the lighthouse at Rubicon Point, which is one of the highest elevation lighthouses in the United States. Throughout the day, though, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. Jake noticed my nervousness and did his best to distract me, pointing out interesting plants and birds, and telling jokes to make me laugh. When we got back to our campsite that evening, everything seemed normal at first. We started preparing dinner, trying to put the strange events of the previous night out of our minds. But as the sun began to set, Casting long shadows through the trees, I saw him again, the same man from the night before, standing at the edge of our campsite. This time he was closer, and I could see him more clearly. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. He was wearing clothes that looked dirty and worn, including a t-shirt that looked suspiciously like one of Jake's missing shirts. Jake saw him too this time. He called out more forcefully than before, telling the man to leave our campsite. The stranger just stood there for a moment, then smiled. A wide, unsettling smile that made my skin crawl, and slowly walked back into the woods. That was the last straw for us. We quickly packed up our essential belongings, not even bothering to take down the tent. We threw everything into the car and drove to the ranger station. The rangers listened to our story with concern. They said they hadn't had any other reports of a strange man in the area, but they promised to investigate and to send patrols through the campground more frequently. They offered to let us stay in a different campsite, one closer to the ranger station, but we were too spooked to stay in the park. We decided to cut our trip short and head home. As we were leaving, we passed another campsite and saw a couple setting up their tent. We felt obligated to warn them about what we'd experienced. We pulled over and told them about the strange man we'd seen and the items that had gone missing from our campsite. They listened politely, but I could tell they were skeptical. The woman thanked us for the warning, but assured us that they'd be fine. They were experienced campers, she said, and they knew how to secure their belongings. As we drove out of the park, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the stranger following us. But there was nothing. Just the darkening road behind us and the towering pines on either side. The drive home was tense and quiet. We were both trying to process what had happened. Had we overreacted? Was there a reasonable explanation for everything we'd experienced? Maybe the man was just a homeless person living in the woods, and he'd taken our things out of desperation. But that didn't explain his strange behavior, or why he kept showing up at our campsite. When we got back to San Francisco, our apartment felt small and confining after the wide-open spaces of Lake Tahoe. But I'd never been so glad to be home. We unpacked our gear, and as we were going through everything, we realized that more of our things were missing than we'd initially thought. Several more items of clothing were gone, as well as a few other small personal items, a bracelet of mine, Jake's pocket knife, even a couple of pages torn from the notebook I'd been using as a travel journal. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We looked online for any reports of similar incidents in the Lake Tahoe area, but found nothing concrete. We considered filing a police report, but we weren't sure what good it would do. We had no real evidence, just our own unsettling experiences. The whole incident left us feeling vulnerable and shaken. It was weeks before I felt comfortable going on hikes in secluded areas again, and even then, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Jake was affected too, though he tried not to show it. I noticed he started taking more security precautions at home, double-checking that the doors and windows were locked before we went to bed. We did eventually go camping again, but we were much more cautious. We chose busier campgrounds closer to populated areas. We invested in a small safe to keep valuables in while at our campsite, and we made sure to introduce ourselves to neighboring campers, creating a sort of informal neighborhood watch. Looking back on the experience now, I still can't fully explain what happened during those few days at Lake Tahoe. Was the man we saw just a troubled individual living in the woods? Was he specifically targeting us? Or were we simply unlucky enough to camp in his territory? And what was his fascination with our clothes? I've turned these questions over in my mind countless times, but I've never come up with satisfactory answers. The incident serves as a reminder that even in beautiful, seemingly peaceful places, there can be hidden dangers. It taught us to trust our instincts, to be more aware of our surroundings, and to take our personal safety seriously, even when we're supposed to be relaxing and enjoying nature. Despite the scare, we haven't let it completely deter us from enjoying the outdoors. We still go camping and hiking, but now we do so with a heightened sense of awareness. We appreciate the beauty of nature, but we never forget that it can also harbor unexpected threats, both from the wilderness itself and sometimes from other people. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.